The South African Jewish Board of Deputies is the organization that engages with the South African government on behalf of the Jewish community. Join Sharice Zeffert for the next hour to find out what the SAJBD has been up to. 101.9 High FM.
Trevor Assison is a British-born, Israeli-based lawyer specializing in litigation. He's the founder and senior partner at Assison Law Offices, providing UK legal services from an offshore location, which is now the largest foreign law firm in Israel. In 2000, he founded BBC Watch to analyze BBC media coverage of the Middle East. A little while back, he published a report on the BBC's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war between October the 7th, 2003 until February the 7th, 2024. While the research was published last year, September, I only recently learnt of it. And as the war continues into its 23rd month, this remains an important discussion. I'm absolutely delighted to have him as my guest now. Trevor, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Trevor, what prompted you to investigate the BBC?
It had been something which I'd done to some degree during the Second Intifada. And so I had some experience, and I was approached by a major Jewish activist organization, Committee Against Anti-Semitism in the UK, when the Al-Aqli hospital occurred. And that was obviously where the press alleged that 500 people had been killed by Israel in a hospital. It turned out that the Palestinians had killed about 100 to maybe 50 to 100 people in the car park of the hospital. But the very damaging report went out and was never properly corrected. Most specifically, was never corrected by the BBC, who claimed to be proud of the work. So I was asked whether or not they could be sued, and essentially, the only way you can bring a claim against the BBC is by looking at their coverage over a long period of time and making sure that you analyze it in a way which is genuinely independent.
Yes, exactly. And let's talk about that. I remember one of the lowest points of my dealing with the media just post-October the 7th was when I was confronting a journalist about the information he was getting from Hamas. And he was like, you have your truth, they have their truth, and what makes you think your truth is more true? And when journalists start questioning truth, I just wonder how you navigate accuracy in reporting on a war.
Well, on one level, you could say that it's not possible to be entirely accurate because people do have different views of the same facts. But the BBC has a legal obligation to be impartial, and it's paid £4 billion per annum by the British people in order to comply with that obligation. And it has about 130 pages of rules, which they claim, if those rules are followed, they will achieve impartiality. So what we did was we didn't try to say what is true or what isn't true, because that, as you correctly say, is a very difficult task. But we tried to see whether or not they obeyed their own rules. And to give you one example, there are very few journalists in Gaza other than Hamas-controlled journalists. There's very, very well documented evidence that Hamas controls every word that goes out of the area where it holds sway. And the BBC has an obligation in its own regulations to say, whenever they're reporting from an area where there are reporting restrictions, to say there are reporting restrictions here. When someone is reporting who has a particular interest in the output, in the story, they have an obligation to say the person who is reporting has a particular interest. For instance, a member of Hamas will have an interest in portraying the story, the truth that they have, in a way that supports their story. The BBC never, or virtually never, complies with that obligation, and either of those obligations. And that's an example where we can actually count the number of times they comply, count the number of times they don't, and call them out for their breaches of their own rules. That's the kind of example where you can say the truth is not the issue here. The issue here is, are you obeying your rules to achieve impartiality, which they're clearly not.
So your report covered 6 months from October the 7th until February the 7th, which was very heightened activity. What did you find in those 6 months?
Well, what we did was we found a number of breaches. We counted 1,500 breaches, but in fact there were far more of the BBC's own rules. What we discovered was that the BBC was not breaching its rules of impartiality; it was totally ignoring them. It had become effectively a mouthpiece for Hamas, and this was most starkly seen where we were approached by a group of large language model experts, data scientists, who assisted us and gave us thousands of hours, particularly Haran Shani Narkis, who was the leader of that group, gave us thousands of hours of their time so that we were able to put forward a detailed analytical report using effectively AI, one of the first reports to use it extensively. And that demonstrated that they were amongst the most extreme English language broadcasters in the world, and that claims not to have, like there were Jewish reporters and Muslim reporters who were clearly going to be at certain ends of the scale. But one of the most extreme was the BBC. But by far and away, the worst was the BBC Arabic. BBC Arabic, when we measured it on a scale showing all different reports across the world, BBC Arabic came out basically next to Al Jazeera. Now, Al Jazeera is essentially a pure pro-Hamas report. And the fact that the BBC, with a duty to impartiality, is putting across almost identical message to Al Jazeera is, to my mind, a remarkable finding. It's shameful, and it makes no sense whatsoever of the foreign language section of the BBC, because the BBC is meant to be using foreign language to peddle the soft power of the British Foreign Office. In other words, to be able to be peddling liberal values of the Western liberal ideology. And what it's actually doing is it's using government money and the money from the license fee to peddle an extremist, pro-Islamist view, which lauds the terrorists that brutally attacked Israel on the 7th of October.
Wow. I mean, in a way, it's kind of more understandable that an Arabic version would be more Islamist or pro-Hamas. But I think the biggest disappointment would be the English language BBC, because, I mean, there were a lot of spoofs made at the time when the BBC was misreporting its on the conflict. But what has the response by the BBC been to your report?
Well, before I answer that question, I just want to mention perhaps the most dramatic finding, because finding that Al Jazeera and the BBC Arabic are very, very similar is disappointing. But as you say, perhaps not surprising. Most of the editors, the senior editors within the BBC, don't speak Arabic. So essentially, it's captured by those journalists that do. What is really remarkable is, and this I had from speaking to people at every level, including board level, former board members, down to mid-level journalists and junior journalists, was to ask the BBC and to look at their own systems to say, what is the methodology you have for measuring whether or not you are complying with your obligations? Do you count how many interviewees you have who are left or right? Do you count how many interviewees who are members of Hamas or its affiliates? Do you count the number of programs that you put out that are demonstrating one side or another of a conflict? And the answer is absolutely shocking, because the BBC, in fact, has no methodology at all for checking whether or not it is complying with its incredibly important obligation of impartiality. It's not that their methodology is defective. They do not have a methodology, and they seem to think that simply getting their journalists to read 130 pages of rules is in itself sufficient to ensure that their journalists are impartial. And that really is why the whole system of the BBC has become simply a mouthpiece for one side or another of any conflict, of which this particular conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas is one example. But there are many other examples where the BBC is completely and utterly failing in its primary duty to the British public and indeed to the world to tell an impartial story. They're just not. They're failing.
Yeah, it's very worrying, very disappointing. You've highlighted so many problems at so many different levels. What was the response of the BBC to your report?
Sorry, I should actually answer your question. The BBC, the report we conducted was into about 9 million words of broadcast. We had a small army of lawyers that were essentially funded by our law firm. My partners very generously allowed us to do that. As I said, the data scientists covered exactly the same material, also acting essentially for free. And it's probably the deepest dive into BBC work that has ever been conducted that I'm aware of. And the BBC realized it was serious. Within 24 hours, I am informed that it was on the board table of the main board of the BBC. Within that 24-hour period, they set out an announcement saying that they were now resolved to conduct an analysis into their Middle East reporting. Now, of course, that's a purely defensive move, but it did show that they realized that the report had demonstrated some very, very significant failures across the BBC's coverage of what is, in fact, a very important story. But from then onwards, they've basically done nothing except to issue a very, very pathetic response. The response was about 15 pages, and it only dealt with about 5 out of 27 different arguments that we put. We did 27 different types of analysis to see what the BBC was achieving. The BBC only responded to about 5. And of those responses, I consider 3 at least were ludicrously weak. And I'll give you one example of what ludicrously weak means. We said that they failed to report within the 5 or 6 months we covered. They failed to report at all on the existence of the Hamas Charter. And the Hamas Charter basically calls upon the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews. And it's really, and it was clearly a motivating factor behind the brutality of the 7th of October attack, which Hamas declares they will repeat as soon as they possibly can. So it's a very important issue. And the fact that the people listening to the BBC don't know about the Hamas Charter, which explains the behavior both of Hamas and the behavior of Israel in feeling a need to end the rule of Hamas, is a fundamental breach. Now, it's a fundamental failure because the BBC accepts the obligation to tell important elements of each story. So what was the BBC's response in their defense? They said, what do you mean we haven't mentioned the Charter? Here is a program, blah, blah. There were 2 problems with that program. One is that it was only broadcast 9 months after the period, or 6 months after the period we were covering. So they were effectively saying, yes, you're right, we didn't mention the Charter. And secondly, even the program they did mention and were using as a defense did not refer to the Charter. So I call that a weak response.
Yeah.
And So essentially the BBC has failed to respond, and they have not answered our appeal of their response
But
at all.
I suppose the benefit, though, is that you have the report and you have discredited them and you have made them aware of their bias.
Yeah. Well, there were 400 million impressions in social media within the first 2 months of the report being issued, which is an indication that it went very widely. It was the subject of debates in the House of Commons and the House of Lords in the British government. It was the subject of an application for the BBC to be analysed by the House of Lords. It's been used in many forums. So yes, it has set out a standard of analysis and demonstrates beyond question that the BBC is in breach of its obligations.
And the BBC has such, it's obviously UK based, but it has such importance throughout the world. It's one of the recognized platforms for disseminating news. Trevor, this would have to be, unfortunately, my last question to you. But as the war has progressed, do you think coverage of it has gotten better or worse?
I think that the recent coverage, which alleges starvation, mass starvation, and brutal killing by the Israeli army, has become totally hysterical. I strongly suspect that there is hunger, sadly and tragically, in Gaza, and there may even be people who have died aggravated by a lack of food. But the fact that Hamas has stolen, even the UN has accepted Hamas has stolen 85% of the aid. The fact that the circumstances under which food is being provided are incredibly difficult, and the fact that Hamas has self-evidently lied in its own statistics, the fact that films have been shown, the one child whose picture was demonstrated starving, we all know was in fact suffering from other diseases, nothing to do with hunger. That some of the pictures used are pictures from Yemen and the Sudan. They're not from Israel at all. There's such a level of deception and such a level of hysteria, which the BBC is right at the front, unfortunately, of promoting this hysterical accounts and virtually never correcting when they are found to have been at fault. So I'm afraid that the BBC has gone over the line. It's no longer a credible news organization, and that, I feel, is one of the problems that's going to emerge for the BBC as a result of this particular story that it's been now badly mismanaging for coming on for 2 years.
Yeah, well, Trevor, thank you so much for joining me. And also thank you for your efforts in holding the media accountable. It's initiatives like this that actually have ripples throughout the world. So thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much
Thank you very much indeed
for sharing that. That was Trevor Asperson, British-born, Israel-based lawyer and founder and senior partner at Asperson Law Offices.